All right, so Elisha, we're dealing with the life of Elisha, and Elisha is the prophet of the Lord. You might remember that he took the place of, and this is Bible trivia for 100, Elisha took the place of this prophet, Brittany? Elijah, right? Elijah. So the Lord, Elijah, Eliyahu, the Lord is my God, Elijah. Anyway, he's taken Elijah's place, and he's carrying Elijah's mantle, and he's doing some miraculous things. And politically speaking, Israel and Judah are on there are two nations heading in two different directions. And you might remember that Israel was one nation under Saul, and under David, and under Solomon, and then Israel splits into two nations. And there's Israel in the north, sometimes also called Ephraim, sometimes called Samaria by its capital city. And then there's Judah in the south, where the capital city is Jerusalem. In general, there are some good kings down there who are worshiping the Lord. Israel, on the other hand, in the north, it's full of turmoil and idolatry. And when the house of Ahab is ruling, it's never going to be a good situation. I mean, Ahab is like the worst. You know, he was like the worst of the worst. And Ahab's son is Ahaziah, and of course Ahaziah dies, and so he dies childless. And so another one of Ahab's sons on the left side of this is Joram, or Jehoram, sometimes called. The king Joram in Israel is called Joram or Jehoram, and the same is true for the king of Judah. Oh man, that's going to bother me. That's going to bother me. It's just going to bother me the whole time. Give me a second. Joe, what do? I want to get this. Why is it doing this? No! Well, it's just going to have to bother me. That 841 is off. Did anyone else notice that? I think I could live with that. I could live with it. I like that. I like that better. Let's do it that way. All right, now I feel better. Now I could preach the rest of the message. You know what would have happened? I would have sat there and looked at it, and I would have been thinking about it because that's just how I am. I'd be thinking about it instead of thinking about what I should. But anyway, so you could see right across from Joram in Israel is Jehoram in Judah. And so you don't get these guys confused. They are contemporaries of each other a little bit. But anyway, they're not good in Israel. And yet God is going to continue to work through his prophets like Elisha. And God is even going to he even brings Israel some victory in spite of their sin, which we've seen. And it is clear up to this point that Israel and Judah, both these nations need to worship the Lord and him alone. Now, in 2 Kings 4, we're going to see at least 4 episodes of Elisha and his miraculous work. Today we're going to look at the first one of those things. We might group a couple of those. I think we're going to group a couple of those together, but today's kind of stands out that we could kind of do by itself. And we're going to look at the first of those 4 miraculous works of Elisha. In today's passage, a woman loses her husband. And she loses her provider and her protector, and that kind of thing happens all the time. Just recently happened with one of our members. And when you lose your spouse, I imagine that's a life-changing thing. I imagine that. And if you lose a godly spouse, I imagine that makes it even harder. But it happens to people. This woman's husband who died, he's a man of God. Check this out in 2 Kings 4, verse 1. Now, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out. So we're dealing with a woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets. So these are you have prophets and their wives, right? These are supposed to be men of God, and it seems that this is a man of God and his wife here. Well, one of the women of the wives of the prophets, sons of the prophets, cries out to Elisha, and she says, "Your servant, my husband, is dead. And you know that your servant feared the Lord." That is, my husband feared the Lord. "And the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." So this is not a good situation. You might remember that Elijah dealt with a widowed woman. And now here Elisha is also dealing with a widow in need. And it kind of shows how important widows are to the Lord. Well, anyway, this woman's husband, he is a prophet. He's a prophet. He's a man of God. He's a God-honoring man, presumably. But apparently, from what we see here, is that he doesn't have a lot of money, this guy. Well, when the woman loses her husband, she's in a tremendously difficult spot. She's poor, she's desperate, she has nothing, and her only source of provision, her only source of income is now gone. And so she cries out to Elisha. She's got to take care of financial matters, and she's left without the money to take care of financial matters. Now that happens today. That happens to people today. And that, by the way, that's why if you're able to afford life insurance is kind of significant. Now I'm going to talk just for a second here about that from the perspective of reasonable scenarios with life insurance. Because maybe you get life insurance when, let's say, you're 47 and it goes until you're 67 or 72 or something like that, and then it runs out. Now it's time for you to kind of re-up and it's just way too expensive. There are situations like that where, things happen. Okay, obviously. Hopefully by then you've become self-insured. Hopefully by then you've saved up enough money to kind of cover your own expenses. But life insurance is so important in modern society. Just as a side note here, a lot of people don't seem to understand that. So many people don't get it, and when they die, they leave their families in very difficult situation where the family now has to go and pay the costs for their burial. And the family sometimes can't even afford to bury them. I've dealt with this so much. As a pastor, I deal with this. I do. I deal with it. And sometimes people are like, look, I had an aunt die and they had no money, they had no life insurance, and someone's got to pay it. Someone's got to pay it. So all the family members end up having to go in and pay for it. And my argument here, again, we're not dealing with this exact issue here, but you could kind of see how this applies. This woman's husband dies, and now she's dealing with a financial burden. Well, if we're not being responsible and kind of getting life insurance or having life insurance, then to me that's a great disservice to the family, because you're setting the family up in potential financial distress, and you're setting the wife and kids up into a situation where there's potential financial distress. And what happens? What happens today? Someone can't pay the funeral expenses. What happens? What do? What's the popular thing to do in that situation today? Abby, you know what it is. Go ahead. Well, that's not a bad guess. That I'm sure does happen sometimes. But, these are sometimes relatively very expensive to... Go ahead, little buddy.
Donate them to science?
Donate the body to science. It's actually not a terrible answer. It's not a terrible answer. Donate the body to science. I wasn't expecting that. It's not a terrible answer. But no, that's not the one I was thinking. Len, was that a hand? Len, was that a hand or no? No. Tom? So like people, they can't afford to bury one of their loved ones. What do they end up doing? Well, cremating is usually a decision people make because it's one of the cheapest things. But if they can't pay for it, they set up a GoFundMe. They set up, right? Did they not? How many times do you see GoFundMes? And so here you have, and I hate to put it this way, but it's just what it is. You know what a GoFundMe is? So that's basically you set up like a website or an account, and you say this person died or whatever else, and we need $10,000, and we want the public to donate into that GoFundMe, so they are funding me. That's kind of what happens. But the way I look at that is you have responsible people who are paying life insurance, and sometimes not always the cheapest thing, and budgeting so that that could happen. But then there are irresponsible people who aren't paying that, and then when they die, they want the responsible people to then go ahead and pay not only for their own stuff that they're being responsible for, but then they pay for the people that aren't being responsible and planning for their expenses. And by the way, you don't have to get the most expensive casket, and you don't have to get the most expensive gravestone and all these different things. I mean, you could get buried relatively inexpensively. You could talk, there's a guy in our church that knows all about that. If you're interested, I'll send you to him. But what you absolutely don't want to do is pawn off your funeral expenses to other people, the people that you love, because you weren't financially responsible enough to do what you should have done. So that's just a kind of a side thought. It's kind of like, it kind of makes me think of like Joe Biden's student debt payoff. Who's ticked off about that? You know what I mean? Like, I went to school, I worked multiple jobs, I was responsible so that I didn't graduate with debt. I paid the price while they're out there they're out there. My classmates were sometimes they were going to spring break and they were going on vacation. You know what I was doing? I was going to work because I needed to pay my college bill. So I would go and I would work all these extra hours, and I read a story about a guy, he wouldn't let his daughter or somebody go into debt, and they worked like crazy, and then Joe Biden went and paid off everyone else's debt. And that guy didn't see anything, so they worked for nothing. You know what I mean? So to me, it bothers me. But now, there's no life insurance in the ancient Near East, and so people would have to kind of save money for their families. But for whatever reason, this prophet was not able to do so. And it may have had something to do with job, because people in ministry don't always make a ton of money. You don't sign up and say, hey, look, I'm going to be making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. That's just not going to happen unless you're Joel Osteen and you feed people lies, like one of these false prosperity gospel preachers, or your Creflo Dollar, or your Kenneth Copeland. God gave me this private jet. And you know who taught me that? And then he quotes, who does he quote? Not Norman Vincent Peale. He quotes Oral Roberts, that's it. Oral Roberts taught me that. Oral Roberts, well, what did God teach you? Did God teach you to prey upon people and take their money and become rich off of it? So this guy, he's not like those guys. He doesn't have a whole lot of money, and this poor widow is in trouble, and she's facing some pretty serious financial problems. It's bad. It's so bad that the creditor has come to take her children to be slaves. Proverbs says that the borrower is slave of the lender. And so there's a principle too that we ought to consider. But this widow, if she can't pay off her debt, she's going to have to give up her 2 children to be slaves, and they're going to have to work off her debt, and she'll have to try to work off her debt, and it's unthinkable. Now try to imagine this. Try to imagine losing your husband, he died, and now losing your children to slavery because you guys weren't able to take care of the debt that you had built up. Now maybe you could say there's financial irresponsibility. We just don't know. We don't know what the context of the situation is. But that's a lot to handle, and that's too much for this poor widow to bear. And if they do enter slavery, now there is like recourse. Does anyone know what the recourse for someone who would enter into slavery, one potential recourse in the ancient world, how they might be able to get out of slavery? Anyone know anything that might happen? You might have seen something like this maybe in, say, the book of Ruth, something similar to this. This idea. What's that? So like there would be a kinsman redeemer, and a kinsman would be a family member, and a redeemer would be someone who would buy you back. So you could have somebody like that who might come in and say, hey, but a lot of times it involves the purchase of property or land, like what we saw in the book of Ruth. Well, apparently she doesn't have anything like that. So she's in a lot of trouble, and she may not be able to make enough money to set them free, and it may take them a long time to be set free. So the situation here is bad. It's bad. Now, I know I've spent a lot of time on one verse, and I know I'm talking about some issues surrounding that one verse. We'll move through the other verses fairly quickly, but isn't there something implied here about like how dangerous and troublesome debt can be? And we live in a society of credit. We really do. We live in a society where people live in debt. We don't know all the circumstances of why she's in debt. The passage doesn't tell us that there was a misuse of money. I'm going to presume that this has to do with the fact that her husband was a prophet and that put him in a state of poverty at some level. That's not the situation for a lot of people today, because where do we live? We live in what used to be, one of the richest nations in the world. Now, we were just talking about this before the service. We were talking about how expensive everything is. We were comparing how much we're spending on groceries a month, and some of those numbers are high. It's a lot. It's a lot to eat these days. But let's face the facts. We live in America, and even though someone called it Bidenomics, who was that? Who said Bidenomics? Someone said that before the service. I don't remember who said that. Bidenomics, was that you? Bidenomics. Even though Bidenomics are in play right now, we're still rich. We are filthy rich. Americans are filthy rich, and we don't even know it. Money is not usually the problem for us. It's usually the misuse of money that's the problem. It's not that we live, the biggest problem is that people don't live within their means. They live outside of their means, and then they expect God to take care of the bill. That's kind of what happened. I remember one person saying, I remember having a conversation with someone about mortgage and not being able to afford a house, and someone saying, well, that doesn't sound like a lot of faith. And just me being like, so let me get this straight. So I could go out and buy like a $500,000 house, which, by the way, today, it's not really that much. Housing it's ridiculous how much a house is today. But anyway, I could go out and buy a $500,000 house. That was my thinking at the time. Now it's like, kind of what houses cost these days, it seems. I don't know, in my area, 300,000 is like the average, I think. But anyway, I could buy $1 million house and just say, God, I'm going to have faith that you're going to pay it. Well, what's that called? If you had to call that a sin, what would you call that? Abby. That's right along the lines of what I'm thinking. Presumption, she says. I would say testing God. Right? It's really the same thing. So I'm presuming upon God. I'm presuming that he's going to take care of my luxuries. But do we have any promises from God that he's going to take care of our luxuries? We're going to come back to that in a second. But anyway, it is a misuse of money that's the real problem here today. Here's some principles to consider before we move on in the passage about debt. 1, don't spend more money than you have. It's like, is that really that hard? Don't spend more money than you make, and don't spend more money than you have. That's a pretty sound principle, right? Isn't that just so common sense? But I don't think people in America understand that. I really don't. I think it's a foreign, like, what? Don't spend more. Now, I understand when you get into tough times, and I understand certain things happen. And so, in case those things happen, here's a second principle. Save up money so that when tough times happen, you're prepared to handle those tough times for a while. Does that make sense? Don't spend more money than you have, and build in some savings into your personal budget. Save some money for rainy days. Fair enough? Those are some, I think, common sense ideas. Someone says about 6 months of salary, but again, what you have today is you have people who are making all kinds of ungodly sacrifices in their lives so that they could live a certain lifestyle. I know this is not the passage, we're going to get back to it, but just some principles about debt and finances. People will, someone said, sacrifice their children on the altar of prosperity. Think about that phrase. They'll sacrifice their children on the altar of prosperity. And they do that by saying, you know what? I'm going to send my kids to Caesar. I'm going to send my kids to the world and let them get educated by the world and all the garbage that's out there in the world. And I'm going to let lost people educate them. And I'm going to let them teach them about evolution and about transgenderism and all this stuff in the public schools so that I could work. Both parents could work and we could make enough money to live and support the lifestyle that we want to live. And so they are sacrificing their children's spirituality, their godliness, maybe even their eternities in order to live in prosperity. Does that happen? Man, that happens. That happens, absolutely. I mean, people will rack up all types of ungodly credit card debt because they're spending too much money on things they don't need. They'll consider things like car payments to be a necessity so that they can get the car they want instead of the car they can afford. Meanwhile, a car payment today, I mean, you could be paying $500, $600, $700 for a car payment, More? More than $500, $600, $700 for a car? Come on. $1,000, $1,200 for a car payment? Is that real? That was more than I was paying for a mortgage. That's outrageous. And they'll make that payment for 5, 6, 7 years. It's more than a mortgage. People let their money control them instead of controlling their money, and that's why I choose to live on a relatively strict budget. And it's not that I can't afford to do things, it's that I choose what I'm going to afford. I choose how I'm going to live. So I set a budget for this amount of money, and you make the sacrifices, and you eat some potted meat sandwiches if you have to. It is what it is. But you do that so that you could live on that strict budget so that you don't end up in trouble. And so what I'll end up doing is every year, I wait until the first pay. So in December, I set up all my estimated expenses, and then I wait until my first paycheck. And the first paycheck, I take that, I figure out how many weeks, I divide that by the number of weeks, and I start entering it into my books on how much money I have to make, how much I have to give to the Lord, how much all my expenses are, and then I figure how far in the positive or negative am I. Then I could think about things like vacation, depending on how far in the negative, or luxuries or whatever else. So that's what I do. I kind of set it up. Is it easy? Not always. Do I always get the things that I want? No. Do I get to go all the places? Listen, if I really wanted to, I could go pretty much wherever I want to go. But I don't do that because I want to live within my budget so that I don't end up in a situation like this. And I refuse to sacrifice my children and their eternity and their godliness so that I could have a nicer house or a nicer car or the best food. I'd rather eat, salmon hot dogs, which we still haven't tried yet. Salmon hot dogs, we haven't tried those yet. I'll have to try those. I'd rather skip it. I'd rather skip a lunch if I have to. I'd rather skip a meal if I have to. I could drink water and then have dinner, and that's my problem. I eat too much dinner is the problem. But I need to eat a bigger lunch and a smaller dinner. I end up skipping lunch and having a huge dinner, and but anyway. There are people who make more money, and I mean a lot more money than I make, and they have 2 incomes on top of it, and they struggle financially because they fail to practice financial wisdom. Now again, I'm not saying that's what's going on here. Here, with this widow, she's not living in rich America. She's living in a relatively poor situation. I tend to think that she's a victim of circumstance, and we need to help people like that. In America, those people are few and far between because we have all types of social programs that help those types of people. But this is a widow who's in a situation where she might lose her children. They might become slaves, and how it would work is you'd be a slave for the next 6 years, and you're supposed to be released on the 7th year, but they don't always practice that. They weren't always practicing those years of release. So who knows how long these kids would be slaves for, and that's a thought that she can't bear. So she cries out to the only person that she knows who can save her. She cries out to Elisha, the man of God, and that's an act of faith. And when Elisha hears that widow's plight, when he hears her trouble, he immediately starts looking for a solution. Check this out in verse 2. Elisha said to her, What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. So he immediately starts looking at her assets. He immediately starts looking, what can we do to help you get out of this situation? And by the way, that's a really good starting point. Look at your assets. Several years ago, I was counseling a couple that was in debt, and they were in some pretty big debt. They were in some debt. And so what we did was we tallied up all their income, we tallied up all their expenses, and then after we tallied up their income and their expenses and their debt, then I said, let's go through your assets. Now, kids, an asset, how would I describe that to a kid? That's stuff that we're going to say stuff, but that's stuff that you own, we're going to say that's worth something. Can we say that? Can we say that and be relatively fair? I mean, assets can be money, assets can be, savings, but we're just going to say, kids, in this case, this is stuff that you own that's worth something. So I start going through and, hey, do you have any cars that you own? How much equity is in your house? That is, how much is your house worth that you would get if you sold it, and different stuff like this. And what we found was that their assets, not including the house, they're not in debt. Including the house, they're completely out of debt. But not including the house, their debt would have been cut considerably by selling their assets. And there was credit card debt that, boom, almost get wiped out by selling an asset or two. And at first they were like, oh, no, I can't sell that. Because they held on to that asset, like that asset was important to them, or to one of them. And what ultimately happened was I said, look, if you want to take care of this credit card bill, sell that. And you don't have credit card debt. And eventually the thought came to eventually he was like, you know what? Yeah, I need to do it. And they sold that thing, and boom, there goes a heavy credit card debt. Just like that, where they're taking all this extra interest, 20% interest or something like that on, say, $20,000. Sell that asset, boom, it's gone. And you didn't really need it. They didn't really need that asset. So they sold it, and boom, it's gone. And they start just knocking off one thing, got out of debt completely. And so it's a good place to start, is to look at the assets. It could bring down debt considerably. Well, Elisha immediately looks at her assets to figure out a solution, and she has no assets whatsoever. All she has, what do you have in your house? Nothing. I have no assets. The only thing I have is a jar of oil. Well, that's not going to help you with debt, right? You have a jar of oil. Well, good luck with that. You could sell that oil, and you might be able to make something from it, but it's not going to pay off your debt to keep 2 kids out of slavery. That's for sure. So essentially the answer is, nothing. I have nothing. But I have this jar of oil. I have nothing. Well, Elisha gives her a plan of action to follow. Check this out. Then Elisha says, go borrow vessels at large for yourself from all your neighbors. Go borrow containers. Empty vessels. And don't get a few. Don't just get a couple of them. Get as many containers as you can get. Borrow them. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons and pour out into all these vessels, into all these containers, and you shall set aside what's full. Well, isn't that something? So go out and borrow all these containers, and then you're just going to pour from that jug of oil and fill all those containers. Well, Elisha's saying that a miracle is going to happen, right? I mean, why else would you be, gathering up these vessels, and what else are you going to, why would you be doing that? So Elisha is telling this woman that God is going to take care of your need. that in this particular circumstance, and not necessarily in every single circumstance the exact same way this happens, that is, I'm not going to just start pouring and things are going to miraculously keep, emptying in. I'd like to do that with sometimes soda. I like soda sometimes, but it's a little sugary sometimes. You love soda. I hear that every time I see you, you've got a can of soda in your hand. But wouldn't it be nice, as expensive as soda was, to just pour into a cup and just drink from it and then pour in and just keep pouring from one can of soda over and over and over? Man, you think about that would save you if you're a soda drinker? Anyway, something like that, except with oil, right? So he's calling her to act on faith. And that's exactly what she does in verses 5 and 6. So she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not one vessel more." And the oil stopped. So she goes out. She borrows as many vessels, many containers as she can. She pours the oil. She fills up every single container that she's borrowed. And by the way, you probably borrow more than you think you could fill. More than you would need. She's probably going out and asking until there's barely any containers left from her friends. She pours into one container, it fills up. She does it with the next and the next and the next. And I imagine, and I don't know this for sure, but I imagine that with each time she pours into a vessel, her eyes light up with amazement that, this is money. Each one of these containers is money. Each one of these containers is going to contribute, selling that is going to contribute to the paying off of her debt. And so she's excited as she pours into each one of these vessels. Her children are watching what is an amazing miracle, seeing the impossible take place before their eyes. And all of them, I have to imagine, all of them realize an important truth. And what do you think that truth is? That this family realizes about God. Anyone want to take a guess? That God cares for them and that He's providing for them. Could you miss that point if you're in that house? God cares for us, for that family. God cares for that family, and God provides. And I've got to imagine that that's an emotional experience for her. I've got to imagine that. I've got to imagine that she understands. I've got to imagine that her amazement increases with each jar that gets filled. I've got to imagine that she understands what this means for her. I've got to imagine that she understands what this means for her family. Well, she asked for one more container, and there isn't one left. Every single one of these containers has been filled by God. And then the oil stops. This is Elisha's fourth miracle in 2 Kings. And then Elisha gives her final instructions. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest." Now she has enough money to pay off her debt, and she has enough money to survive on the rest. That's a huge miracle. That's something you don't see every time you open the pages of your Bible. She has that money, she has that provision because God provided it. And God provided it, and it's clear that God provided it because He cares. God cares. He cares for this poor, destitute widow. She may not be much in the eyes of the world, but she matters to God. And you know what? You do too. You may think, I'm not much. You may think, hopefully it's better than thinking I'm like the best, the greatest thing in the world. Like Donald Trump, I don't think he thinks he's not much. I get the feeling from listening to Donald Trump that he thinks very highly of himself. Anyone else get that feeling? I hit a hole in one. I did it. So-and-so saw me do it. I hit the hole. I make fun of it. I'll do that about myself sometimes, just because it's funny. because he sounds like a buffoon sometimes when he does it. He's so proud. But you may not think much of yourself. You may have a realistic view of yourself and realize, who am I in a world of, what are we at, 7 billion people? Who am I in a world of 7 billion people? But let me tell you, God cares for you. You matter to the Lord, and God wants to provide for you because he cares for you. And he knows what you're going through, and he always wants what's best for you. It may not be money, it may not be riches, but he knows what's best for you, and he wants what's best for you. Again, the problem with society today is that people expect God to write a blank check. You know, in this passage and in others, God provides for the widow's needs, but he doesn't necessarily make her rich. Today, people want God to provide for their luxuries. They want the expensive mortgages and car payments, and they want to make foolish decisions and stick God with the bill. That's, again, a form of testing God, but that's not how God works. God provides for our needs. And we sometimes have a hard time distinguishing between needs and luxuries. We put so many things in the need category that really belong in the luxury, don't we? So many things are luxuries. Like, for instance, the internet. You know what? I don't want to go there, because the internet really feels like a need to me. But I mean, when it really comes down to it, the internet, isn't it a luxury? I mean, it's really valuable, it's really helpful, but for most of us, the internet's really a luxury. Like two cars is a luxury. I didn't always have 2 cars growing up. I remember having to ride the bus once or twice, perhaps more than that. That's a weird feeling, getting on the bus because you don't have a car. You know, that's not the funnest thing in the world, but not every family, you know, a second car is a luxury. Television is a luxury. Suits, multiple pairs of shoes, your wardrobe, most of that stuff is luxury. You know, a strong diet involving many meats. Well, that's a need. Now, that's a luxury, right? So all these things we kind of put in, don't we kind of put those things in the wrong category? Like, we could live so much more within our means than we think. And we put those things, we put these luxuries in the category of needs, and we say, you know what, God needs to provide for that. I expect God to provide for that. The fact of the matter is, God provides for your needs and well more than those needs. It just doesn't always feel like that because we don't understand the difference between needs and luxuries. We really don't. Even I don't. I know, like, in my mind, I kind of know this is a luxury, that's a luxury, but we're so spoiled with luxuries that they all feel like needs. You know what I mean? God provides for our needs because he cares for us. And that reminds me of something that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, you know, Jesus spoke in Matthew 6 about storing up treasure in heaven, not on earth. And of course, today people store up treasure on earth at the expense of treasure in heaven. That is, they live for the here and now and do all these things for the here and now. And one day they're going to get to heaven and realize, man, I've really messed up. I really messed up. I focused on the wrong stuff. I made too many spiritual compromises for all these earthly things. You think that's going to happen? That's definitely going to happen. But anyway, Jesus talks about storing up treasure in heaven, not on earth. And then he spoke about not worrying because God will provide. And you've all heard this passage, I'm sure. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food? And the body more than raiment? Does it say raiment, Tom? It says raiment. Raiment is clothing. That's King James Version for clothing. Is the body more than raiment? Look at the birds of the air. First time I saw that word raiment in the King James, I'm like, what's raiment? I've never heard of raiment before. Anyone else read the King James and wonder what raiment was the first time? Or renting clothes? You know, that means tearing clothes. The first time I read it, I'm like, did they go to the tux? Did they rent tux? Well, I don't understand what's going on. Well, they're getting upset, and then they're going to the rental. Well, I don't understand what's going on here. Well, the language has changed a little bit in 500 years. Is it 500 years? I guess it's only 400 years. I got to go back and do math. Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? Like he takes care of the birds, don't you think he's going to take care of you? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself, not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, to the furnace, to the oven, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Do not worry then, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or wherewithal shall we be clothed? That's how the King James reads, I think. For the Gentiles eagerly seek all these things, for your heavenly Father knows that you need all these things. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Instead of worrying, we need to have faith. We need to trust that God will provide, that God cares for us, and that he will provide for us. But he will not give you a blank check for all of your worldly desires. God wants to provide for you because he loves you and because he cares for you. That's the principle I see in this passage. Anyway, let's take our hymnals and turn to 405.